Good to be with you. Let's get to the stories, though. Keep liking the stream. Like the stream, like the stream, like the stream. Hit that notifications bell when you subscribe to this channel so you know that I'm coming on. Share it around. And I'm seeking 10 more subscribers for the month, this month. 10 more. So you can do that at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong at whatever amount that you can. That helps sustain this journalism. So please do support my work. I appreciate all those who already are. Thank you so much. So, all right, let's get to it then. First things first. All right. Where do we even begin? Because this week, the last few weeks have been, I don't even know, just a whirlwind. So let's begin with Somalia. So Joe Biden's administration has announced that it will be sending hundreds of special forces to Somalia in a reversal of a Trump policy, which actually removed those special forces before his administration went out of the door. And this move, right, has been rightfully called kind of like a re-invasion of Somalia. And I'll just pull up the article really quickly from the New York Times that announced this. In predictable fashion, this is being portrayed as a move by the United States to kind of recommit to terrorism, right? So here's the article. Let me just scroll all the way up here for you. So Biden approves plan to redeploy several hundred ground forces into Somalia. The president also signed off on targeting about a dozen Shabab leaders. Okay, there we go. We got some drone strikes coming in the war-torn country from which Donald J. Trump withdrew in his final weeks of office. So here we have about 700 ground troops who had been stationed there were pulled by Trump, but Biden is going to send hundreds more. He also approved a standing authority, Pentagon request to give standing authority to target about a dozen leaders of al-Shabaab. So what this means is that there are going to be drone strikes, which has been the case in Somalia for quite some time. The United States has been dropping drone strikes in Somalia for a long time, killing hundreds of people. So airstrikes have largely been limited to those meant to defend partner forces facing immediate threat, supposedly. So this is all about al-Shabaab, they say. Al-Shabaab, al-Shabaab. So they'll revive an open-ended American counterterrorism operation that has amounted to a slow-burning war through 3 administrations. The move stands in contrast to a decision last year to pull American forces from Afghanistan, saying it is time to end the forever war. So basically, what all Joe Biden has done is say, okay, we're going to pull troops from Afghanistan, but we're going to redeploy them elsewhere. I mean, this is just classic U.S. imperialist policy. It's something that's happened over and over and over again. And I'm actually going to play for you a report by Glenn Ford that shows when Obama did this, okay, in 2011 in the region, this time with Uganda. But nonetheless, the decision to reintroduce a persistent presence was made to maximize the safety and effectiveness of our forces and enable them to provide more efficient support to our partners, said the National Security Council spokeswoman Adrienne Watson. So she did not indicate the number of troops that the military would deploy, but the cap would probably be around 450. That will replace a system in which U.S. troops training and advising Somali and African Union forces have made short stays since Mr. Trump issued what Ms. Watson described as a precipitous decision to withdraw. So, of course, Trump is bad because he did not want troops in Somalia. This is the irony. This is the confusion, right? A lot of people get, there's a lot of confusion. A lot of people think that Trump is anti-war. Okay, no, we should not be calling Trump anti-war. But there are certain decisions, certain policies like this one, which did grind at the Pentagon, like withdrawing troops from Africa. I mean, I remember that, right? You remember the terrorist attack that happened on U.S. forces, I believe, what was that, in Niger? And after that, the Trump administration was like, nah, let's pull them out. Let's get people out, the troops out. And it received a lot of backlash, right? So there are many policies like that that Trump tried to pursue. The DPRK talks as well was another one where there was just this backlash, right? And then when Trump would drop missiles on Syria, he was presidential. So this is how it is to be a US president, to be commander in chief of imperialism. You do what the military industrial complex says and you're praised as a hero. You get underneath its skin and kind of grind against some of its policy objectives and say no once in a while and maybe try to do your own thing, then you're seen as a criminal. So anyway, we don't need to continue going on with the New York Times about this. They don't really tell us much. There's a statement by Hood Communists that was published by Hood Communists from the Horn of Africa, Pan-Africans for Liberation and Solidarity, HOA PALS, that I'm going to read. It's very short, but it gives kind of an overview of the history of the U.S. in Somalia, a war that's not really acknowledged as a war. And this is the problem that we have, is that African wars on the African continent tend to be marginalized, especially those where the U.S. is involved in the West, right? It's this kind of recycling of colonialism, that Africa is not as valuable maybe in the mindsets of even the most progressive and anti-imperialist leftists. So they don't look at what's going on in the African continent with the same degree of concern. And so you don't really hear people saying in our part of the world, well, how about that US war on Somalia? Probably should stop it, right? Probably should end that war. While it's been mainstream that, yeah, the US war in Afghanistan was a disaster. The US war in Somalia, well, it's an afterthought. But this has been going on for decades, right? The U.S. involvement in Somalia is decades long. Somalia is resource rich. Somalia is geostrategically important when you look at where it is located in the Horn of Africa. And of course, just like any other U.S. war, the concern about China is really paramount, because China's investment in the Horn of Africa is very lucrative. It's very important. And the U.S. has responded to that through a campaign of destabilization, a campaign of militarization. And so Somalia really stands at this very important position in a broader war on the continent, where the U.S. is recolonizing it through the U.S. Africa Command. And the Western countries that are junior partners of the United States are all on board for that. They're all on board for this recolonization process, because they too see the problems that could arise should African countries, no matter what government they may adopt, if these countries begin to chart their own course. And so this is part of a broader campaign. And I just want to bring up this HOA PALS article that was published, the statement that was published last year in Hood Communist, where they say, demand an end to the U.S. shadow war in Somalia. And so this just provides, I think, a good history, right? So a good history of U.S. involvement. And they say 20 years ago, the CIA and Joint Special Operations Command under George W. Bush began supporting warlords in Somalia to kill and target what the U.S. deemed Islamists, escalating tensions in the area. 6 years later, the Bush administration began an undeclared war in Somalia, launching airstrikes as part of the nation's imperialist expansion efforts, particularly referred to as the War on Terror, starting in Mogadishu, with reports claiming that the strikes eventually expanded to all parts of Somalia. These drones and airstrikes were and are conducted by AFRICOM, United States Africa Command, which was established in 2007 by Bush and later expanded under Obama. Since then, scores of Somali people have been murdered by drones, cruise missile strikes, AC-130 gunships, naval bombardments, and attack helicopters by both the CIA and U.S. Special Operations Command under AFRICOM. And that's going to continue As the New York Times article, I didn't read it, but the New York Times article makes clear that Stephen Townsend, head of U.S. Africa Command, is going to head this redeployment. And we're probably going to see more of this. And according to Air Wars, this has resulted in 249 U.S. actions in Somalia since 2007, resulting in 2,682 deaths of Somali people as of today. So it's about 15 years and nearly 2,700 people killed. U.S. attacks in Somalia triggered a great deal of people to flee the violence, inflicting 188,000 people displaced in 2019 and 295,000 people displaced in 2020. So hundreds of thousands of people moved out of Somalia because of this. I don't hear Ilhan Omar saying nothing about this. That's all I got to say about that. AFRICOM has reluctantly admitted only 5 casualties in Somalia after denying any for so long, yet no families affected by AFRICOM have been compensated. Thousands of Somali people, many with no ties to any actors in the conflict, have been murdered, and countless more have had their lives altered through injury and displacement. Reports indicate that these same folks receive death threats if they dare to speak out against U.S. war crimes. So maybe that's why Ilhan Omar doesn't speak out. Maybe, perhaps, but she's got quite a big platform to do so right now. Nonetheless, let's continue. There's no way to seek justice. How do people get bombed in the dark by a plane get justice? A survivor who left her village because of drone attacks where she lost her son-in-law and nephew and had no affiliations with Al-Shabaab. So I guess that was a survivor. U.S. airstrikes in Somalia are hitting an all-time high during the coronavirus pandemic, despite calls for armistice from many countries, including U.S. allies. The Trump administration and the Biden administration continue the mission to enact violence against Somali people. Even though U.S. troops are relocated to other parts of East Africa in early January, there has been a rapid increase in U.S. airstrikes in Somalia, of which the current rate will greatly exceed the number of airstrikes committed in prior years. And as this announcement shows of Special Operations Forces, we can add probably a lot more on the way. So some background here. So the Pentagon has been in Somalia for a long time, since before the U.S. Africa Command was founded in 2007. So in 2001, the Bush administration dispatched CIA and Special Operations Command forces to Somalia to support warlords and the hunting down of Islamists as part of America's 9/11 response. The more money and weapons the U.S. gave to warlords, the more violent they became, provoking a stronger reaction and opposition. So here's an important point. So the Islamic Courts Union was an association of 13 groups finally came together to stabilize the government as a response to warlords in order to develop a government that would usher in a new state and make attempts to throw what they deemed to be Somalia's oppressive warlords out of the country in an attempt for stability. In response, the United States has funded the creation of the Warlord Alliance in 2006 to seize control of Mogadishu and challenge the influence of the Islamic Courts Union, but their offensive failed, and the Islamic Courts Union was briefly successful. This angered the Bush administration and culminated in support for the 2006 Ethiopian invasion of Somalia, which resulted in the massacre of 8,000 people. And a note about this Ethiopian invasion, similar to what has happened in Sudan, and I don't know if this is still true because of the controversy that's happening in Ethiopia right now, but the Ethiopian military, there were speculation at this time that they were actually under the command of the United States, that a lot of them were receiving salaries from the United States and under the command of the United States. So massive war crimes were committed by Ethiopia and the CIA on the grounds of executing renditions of torture on Somali people and special operations forces participating via AC-130 gunships. Violence was further perpetrated as famine was another horrendous outcome of this invasion, resulting in 250,000 Somalis dying of starvation from 2010 to 2012 because of the chaos caused by U.S. imperialist efforts. The violent war completely disrupted the economy of the country and all local food distribution systems. Al-Shabaab was the youngest group and had the least sphere of influence in the ICU, but once the war began, the other groups disbanded back to their local territories, while Al-Shabaab fought the insurgency against the Ethiopian troops, temporarily driving them out. Al-Shabaab resorted to begging Saudi princelings for money in 2012 after Kenyan forces influenced by the U.S. invaded and forced Al-Shabaab from their base in the port city of Kismayo. This financial assistance required Al-Shabaab's allegiance to Al-Qaeda, taking place 11 years after George W. Bush started attacking Somalia days after September 11th and 6 years after Washington backed the Ethiopian war on Somalia. Thus, the U.S. war on terror in Somalia predates the existence of any extremist organization in Somalia, and in fact, as seen in other nations, actually commenced their inception. So this is a really good point here. The United States destroyed the Islamic Courts Union using Ethiopia as its proxy, and by destabilizing that government, actually compelled al-Shabaab, which was a minority force, a fundamentalist force, so-called Islamist force in the Islamic Courts Union, to seek help from al-Qaeda, driven to al-Qaeda because there was no other force that was willing to help, and the governance situation in Somalia had been dissolved and had been essentially turned into a state that could not govern itself. So there you have it. When the US causes destabilization and destruction around the world, it ferments and breeds terrorism, not to mention the fact that the US outwardly supports terrorism. So the reality is there has long been transnational interest in Africa's natural resources. AFRICOM is ushering in another scramble for Africa. In the case of Somalia, oil corporations from Europe, the US, and Canada are engaged in a search for petroleum. So anyway, HOA Pal condemns all of that. Somalia is very important, as it says its coastline is on the Indian Ocean and its access to the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf of Aden. They're very significant for shipping lanes as it relates to energy resources and the military. So the military has its sights set on Somalia for very good reasons, all right? And this war on Somalia is going to continue now that this new scramble for Africa really has China at its heart. The whole point of all of the U.S.'s activities in Somalia is not just to gobble, or in Africa in general too, it's not just to gobble up the resources, because the U.S. actually has a limited capacity for those resources. And I'll tell you why. It's because the U.S. has a really hard time with investment right now. You all know this. You all know that the United States is struggling with investment generally. The economy, the capitalist economy, is very unstable right now with all the inflation. The way that U.S. imperialist policy on Russia has really sent shockwaves through the economy. But that only tells one part of the story. The whole story is that the United States just doesn't have the capacity to invest because it's dominated by finance capital. Finance capital does not want to really invest, it wants to plunder. So there's always going to be a limit for how much these countries are going to be plundered in and of themselves, because there's not much that can be done with that. They're not going to reinvest in the countries that they're plundering for resources like oil and cobalt, etc., bauxite, which Somalia has a lot of. No, they're going to take it, use it for the corporations, but it's going to be limited, and it's not going to really engender much economic investment overall.